All right, good morning or good afternoon. This is Mark Powers, and this is the Loom that I'm getting ready to record is the day one presentation for ACT Prep, just in case I'm quarantined or off or sick, or you're sick or off or quarantined, and you miss that day that I'm introducing you to the test, the kind of things that we need to pay attention to improve your test scores. And so I've got pulled up here on the screen. You can see a Powers ACT group, and down here you'll see Miss Miners posted some material as well. And I have the first day's presentation posted as a link here that you can go in and take a look at that. And so I'm going to go through this, talk to you about the test and testing strategies. You should receive a copy of this for you to put in your folder. And so if I'm absent or if you missed and you'd like to go through this, I want to try to run through this presentation. Not going to read it word for word, but most of you know enough about the ACT to know what it is. What you may not realize or know is that the ACT as a whole, not just the science, but most of the test is made up of skills that you would have gotten in K through 8. You learn a little math. We basically, by K through 8, the knife has been made. We just sharpen it when it gets here. And so we're honing those skills that you have to get you to a point where you can use them better, and trying to streamline some of that and get you what you need, okay? So the science test is definitely a skills test. There is very little content knowledge ever on that. There may be one content knowledge question on the whole test, and it's usually a mainstream science question, something that you've had, usually a biology or chemistry type question that draws on things that you've covered since probably the second or third grade. Things about biology that you see all the time, or something in the physical sciences that you see repeatedly. So there may be that. But mostly this test draws on your reading skills, okay? That's why reading is such an important thing, and why students who read historically and read a lot do better, because you can read faster the more you read, and you can better understand what you're reading, which improves your speed. The science test is like any of the rest of them. It's going to push your skills to get done and do the questions quickly and efficiently and get them correct. And so the better your reading skills and the faster and the more effectively you'll be able to read and understand the questions. Okay, so really no content knowledge. Okay, science skills that you need: reading graphs, tables, interpolating outside of those graphs. The ACT is notorious for taking a graph or a chart and then asking you questions about what would happen outside of the bounds of that graph that you see on the page, okay? What would happen? Would it be increasing, decreasing? Those kind of science things. So basic math skills, such as calculating average or finding the means and things like that. Those are the skills that you need, and those are all pretty much K through 8 skills. Again, you get them reinforced in high school, and maybe a little more difficulty level in high school than you had in elementary. The science test is the last of the 4 tests that day. You've been testing for 3 hours at that point, and you're tired and you're ready to be done. So that makes the test even more difficult. It also has the highest benchmark of the 4 tests with a 23. The benchmark on that's 23. And you've probably heard of benchmarks. You may sort of know what they are. You may absolutely know what they are. But what are benchmarks? Students who meet a benchmark on the ACT, in other words, that score in English, in math, in reading, in science, have approximately a 50% chance of earning a B or better, and approximately a 75% chance of earning a C or better in the corresponding college course or courses for that subject area. That means that if you go to college and take a entry-level science class, probably a biology or a chemistry or something like that, that you are probably going to pass it if you meet benchmark, okay, that you've got a high likelihood. And now colleges and scholarship committees that use this really want you to graduate, okay, because it's graduates that send money back to the schools and send money back to the scholarship committees. It's the graduates that do that, not people that don't graduate typically. So they're wanting you to graduate. So they're going to look at those scores and those benchmarks, and it's going to play a role in receiving money and getting admissions into some programs. Okay. Science Subtest has 40 questions and it's 35 minutes long. So you've got 35 minutes to do 40 questions, gives you a little less than 1 minute per question. It is typically now divided into 6 passages, with each passage a separate mini test in itself. In other words, you've got 6 little tests that are completely independent in there. And typically, even within those tests, even within the passage, the first few questions in the passage are easier than the last few questions in the passage. Not always, but for the most part, that's the case. So the test is kind of like a lot of tests. It starts out with easier, simpler, more concise questions and moves to harder and more difficult questions. So if you look at 6 passages and 40 questions, you've got 6-point-something questions. So some of the passages are going to have 6 questions and some are going to have 7. You might have a 5 and 8 situation, but most of the time they're going to average around 6 questions a passage. You're going to have about 5 minutes and 49 seconds to complete each passage if you use up all your time wisely, and that's a good thing to try to maintain that, okay? There are 3 different types of passages on this test, and of those 3 types of passages on the science test, one is called data representation, which I abbreviate as DR. The other word is research summaries, RS, and conflicting viewpoints, CV. You'll see these abbreviations on reports from time to time. On a typical 6-passage test, there will be 2 data representation passages, 3 research summary passages, and 1 conflicting viewpoints. They may be in any order. The conflicting viewpoint may be first. They may be in the same past types back to back. They may be all shuffled up. Historically, back in the older tests several years ago, I had always noticed that the conflicting viewpoint seemed to be typically the last, and the conflicting viewpoint is the most difficult. If you look at this next paragraph, you'll find that typically the conflicting viewpoint passages are most difficult for students, and that's students all over the United States. That's a national average, that type of passage is harder for everybody, not just people from a certain geographical area or some subgroup of people taking the test. It's pretty much the same for everyone. The data representation, typically students as a whole score better on it. It's not that it's always easier, but it's sort of more straightforward. Below is a detailed description that I found online about each of the types of passages, and we're going to work through those. The conflicting viewpoint is a little more qualitative, and that means it's subject more to some interpretation, but it's usually there's a little more subjectivity in some of that. You have to think a little bit more, read a little bit more. It is, again, a point where reading plays a huge role, especially reading comprehension. Additionally, you should be aware that the writers for questions for the ACT attempt to trap a careless student. This is not that they're writing trick questions. What they're doing is they're writing questions that are designed to lead a student astray if they're not a good reader and they're not diligent and they're not very conscientious about reading those answers carefully. One of the things that you'll see, just one, is that they will ask a question about some point on the test, and then they will get one of the answers will be a direct word for word quote out of another part of the passage that typically has nothing to do or doesn't answer the question at all. And what it does is a student sees that and sometimes says, oh, that's right out of the passage word for word. That's got to be the right answer. So you've got to be careful for those kind of things that you don't do that. And, typically that's something that you'll see a lot. Another thing that you need to be very cognizant of and aware of on this test is that out of the 40 questions, typically over 20 of those questions will start out the question by saying, in figure 1, in table 2, comparing study 2 to study 3. Things like that, where they're addressing and actually telling you where to look in the passage for the answer. So if they tell you the answer is in table 2, it's not in table 1 or table 3. It's in table 2. They're not trying to trick you or waste your time. The answer is there. That's where it is. And so you need to be aware of some of those things. You also need to be aware that when you reach that 5-minute mark, you'll be warned when 5 minutes are remaining. Now, if you think about it, you've got 40 questions on a bubble sheet that you have to bubble. And if you think about how many questions could I bubble if I was just bubbling in a straight line, in other words, if I bubbled something in the first column that would be A or whatever that offsetting letter is that they use, or B or C or D. If I picked a straight line and stayed in it, how many could I bubble? Well, the truth is in 5 minutes, you could probably bubble 20 anyway, maybe more, depending on, so you could bubble a lot. So if you're not finished with this test, okay, if you're not finished and that 5 minutes is called, that doesn't mean you quit right that second and start bubbling in a straight line, because you do need to bubble in a straight line. Why? Is because out of those 40 questions, about 10 are in the A column, 10 are in the B column, 10 are in the C column, and 10 are in the D column, the fourth column. So statistically, if you bubbled a straight down the column, you'd probably get about a fourth of them right, okay? And you need over 20. You need over half to even get close to benchmark. About 25 or 6 in that range is going to get you that 23 you need. So you need a little more than 50%, but not 75%, okay? So if you looked at 5 passages and you only did 5 passages and you took your time and you spent a lot of time on them and you did them very well and you got most of them right, that's 5 times 6 is 30. So you're pushing 30 questions. And then if you guessed on the other passage and you got a fourth of them right, that's probably going to be between 1 to 2. So you could theoretically get in the mid to high 20s and only really attack 5 passages well. So this test is very doable for you, for any student, if you understand it and know what you need to do to get the job done. And, so it's within your reach to get that benchmark if you apply yourself towards the design of this test and you perhaps read some to pick up your skills, and we practice these different type passages. You need to know how to identify these passages when you see them, because you don't have to do this test in order. You have to be very careful that you don't mess up bubbling if you don't do it in order. But if you come to a passage that's hard, you can skip it and come back to it. There is nothing that requires you to do these passages in order, just like any of the other subtests. You can jump around some. I know they talk about doing that, especially in reading, but in science, it's especially important too, because like I said, if you're a person that gets rattled by something difficult, leave it to the end. Leave the difficult to the end, come back to it. That way, if you run out of time, you can guess at it because it was going to be harder for you anyway. So let's take a look at these individual passages and talk about these. Data representation are typically the most straightforward of the 3. They present studies with a few figures tables, graphs, charts with accompanying experiment descriptions. They don't typically have long text passages for you to read. And as a matter of fact, I think most people recommend that you don't read the passages, that you go straight to the questions, read the questions, and then find them. And as I've said, about 20 out of the 40, 20 plus, say 22, anywhere from 20 to 24 questions will tell you where the answer is. So you might read that the question says in figure 1, so you know to go read the question and go look in figure 1. So especially with these, I would not recommend reading the passages in its entirety, especially if you're a slow reader. You'll end up reading the passage as you try to seek the answers for the question. So I would find the answers. You'll notice down here at the bottom of this rundown on this, it says you can recognize data representation packages because they don't have headers such as Experiment 1, Study 1, or Scientist 1. They're usually going to have something like Table 1 or Figure 1 or something like that, okay? Then the next type is research summaries. Research summaries provide descriptions of one or more related experiments or studies conducted by hypothetical scientists or science students. These passages generally have more text than data representation, so they're going to be a little more lengthy, more reading, going to slow you down a little bit more because you've got more to read. The design, they have sometimes processes that you'll have to look at, like a system process where you would follow some piece of machinery or some type of process laid out. You can easily recognize them because they will typically include one or more experiments or studies with headers such as Experiment 1, Trial 1, and so on, okay? Again, I would not recommend reading the passage text. I would go straight to the questions and then seek to find those answers myself. Conflicting viewpoints, there's only one of these typically. Now, that's not to say it could change. ACT sometimes changes things up, but there's one passage on each ACT science test. This passage typically presents 2, although sometimes 3 alternative viewpoints. It's like Scientist 1 and Scientist 2, or Study 1 and Study 2. So they're different viewpoints. Some people refer to them as fighting scientists. They're typically going to disagree on some point. They are probably going to agree on some points. They like to ask you questions about how they disagree and how they agree. Just like on the data representation and the conflict and the research summaries, they will often refer in the question to ask you compare in Scientist 1 versus Scientist 3, what was different about those two things. They'll ask you a question and kind of tell you which of the scientists you have to look at, okay? So there is some guidance and some things, and you should be keeping this in your mind that you don't have to look through the whole passage. It's not going to trick you in that respect, okay? That's not a trap or a trick. So you can recognize conflicting viewpoint passages because they typically have no figures or these passages in full, and because you need to read these in full. So this one you need to read, okay? So if you're a slow reader and you perhaps don't read as well as you would like, you definitely need to leave this for last. This would be the best passage. If you have to guess, this would probably be, for most people, the best passage to guess on, okay? And so you need to practice all 3 of these passages. You need to find out how you do, how long it takes you to read these conflicting viewpoints, how long it takes you to do a data representation. We are going to do that over the next period of months, and we're going to try to get you to understand how much time it requires you to do these questions and to get these answers right, and what you're doing wrong with them, and what's going on with these passages, because we want all of you to get as close to benchmark as you can or exceed benchmark and improve your score. And if you just follow these simple steps on how to take this test, you can improve your score anywhere. I've seen people go up from a couple points to 10 points just by applying these techniques and getting their ability to answer all the questions, to take the tests in a timely fashion, and improve their skills. Okay. And also, if you, it's not too late for you to start reading anything. Read anything. Anything you read, if you read for comprehension, in other words, you read for pleasure, enjoyment, or to find out information, will improve your testing ability. So have a great day if we hadn't seen you in person, and I hope this helps you, and looking forward to a lot of practice and hard work towards this.